Hey guys, so welcome back. It's been a week off, and we are going to get back into Photoshop. So I have a tutorial that I performed last semester, just on brushes and the basics of using a brush, and I'm going to include that in its entirety. And I think that that's a fine thing to if you just do that, it's totally fine. But I'm also going to include an additional thing. So if you go through the first tutorial and you're like, okay, that was way easy for me, I have a second one right at the end, and it's not much different. It's just a more complicated process. So if you feel like the first one is just too easy for you, definitely do it and post the results of that, but also do the second thing. And I don't anticipate a ton of you guys doing that because it is very time consuming, but you can end up with a really nice portfolio piece at the end of the day. So one thing before we get into the tutorial, I had at least one email having trouble getting their images uploaded to Canvas so that they can embed and stuff. And I would be willing to bet that if you're having trouble with that specifically, which, by the way, if you are and didn't post your stuff because of that, feel free to email me so you can get your points. You can just email me your memes as like an attachment or embedded in an email or something. Anyway, if you're having trouble getting things onto Canvas, I would be willing to bet that you've run out of space on your Canvas account. So everything that you upload is saved to your profile, and there's not a whole lot of space that you have. So if you want to delete some stuff that may be taking up space, if you log into World Classroom and click on Account, you'll see Files. We click on Files, and we can see a whole bunch of stuff that is saved here. So I have a meme, and I have all of these classes. I might have like files in, like within these like class folders. Tons of stuff, right? So if I needed to delete something, I can just click the three dots over here and click delete. I'm not sure if you can do more than one at a time, which is troublesome, but let's go ahead and try real quick. We'll delete all three of these, four of those. Nope, one at a time it looks like, and that's a total pain in the butt. But you know, if you have very large files, you can delete those like that. So at the very bottom of the page here, you can see I have only 8% taken up of my, I did 209 megabytes. That's how much I'm using currently. And I guess what you get, like a gig or something like that, a couple gigs. So if you're out of space here, you'll see that your bar is pretty much filled up or completely filled up. And with, you know, 2 gigs of space or a little bit more, you should have some files that are very large in there. And if you only needed them for the one class and that class is done now, feel free to delete those things. Hey, I think I figured something out. So if I select 3, hold on, click, hold and shift, click again. I got a bunch of things. Now I can click delete, and now it'll delete 4 at a time. Okay, sorry about that. It is a little bit easier. So if you find a bunch of files that you want to delete, that's how you do it. Even if you aren't out of space, it's kind of helpful to keep things like nice and clean in your Canvas account and stuff. If you're still having trouble, if it isn't this, but you can't embed for some other reason, reach out to me. We'll set up some kind of Zoom or something, and I'll look at what's on your computer and maybe help you out that way. All right. Sorry for the aside. Let's get into these tutorials.
So let me show you this really quickly before we get into the actual tutorial. So if I'm typing in my type tool here and I type something like this, okay, so clearly a spelling error here. If I highlight, go to edit, and then check spelling, it's going to find that that MSSED is not in Adobe's dictionary, and it will suggest a different word there. Like if I messed up, it would assume that that's what I actually wanted and kind of inform me of that. That said, if you are used to spell checkers in like Microsoft Word or online, you're probably more used to something that can discover things with grammatical issues or incorrect usage of words. So if I type something more like this, oh no, but it should be N-O instead of K-N-O-W. If I try that same check spelling, it's really just checking the spelling of words. It's not looking for other types of errors. So if you find yourself prone to maybe making some mistakes like this, there's no judgment on my end, but it might be in your best interest to maybe use a spell check outside of Photoshop before you put it into Photoshop. So if it's a long bit of text, maybe pop that into Microsoft Word or maybe even something in your web browser before copying and pasting into Photoshop. So I'm going to go into Photoshop. I already started this Photoshop project here, but we can make a new one. So I'm going to go to File and New and create a new project. I already have this custom canvas size, but I'd like for you just to punch in the numbers for me. That way we can get used to common pixel ratios for a computer. So width, let's put 1920, and height, let's put 1080. This is the general resolution for a lot of screens. So if you have a 1080p television or if you have a 1080p monitor at home, this should fill out your monitor pretty well. We're going to do this with the intention that you could use it for a desktop background. So 1920 by 1080 here would be great. Resolution at 300 pixels per inch. You might not think that that would do anything, but once you get into using rulers and stuff like that, that will matter even if you're not going out to print. Color mode RGB, since we are intending for this to be used on a computer. Background contents, I'm going to choose white, but you can choose whatever color you'd like. Color profile sRGB, and then this stuff is great, and square pixels is also good for us. So I'm going to go ahead and press create, and it's going to make a brand new project for me. That's going to be called Untitled-1, and we can clean this up a little bit too. So rather than Untitled-1 being saved wherever it's being saved, let's go ahead and correct that real quick. So we'll go to File and then Save As, Shift Control S if you're trying to be quick about things. I'm going to click Save to my computer now, and I'm going to find a good place to save my stuff where I should be able to find it pretty easily. If that's the desktop for you or your external hard drive, that's a good idea. I'm going to name my project Coloring Book. And our project isn't exactly a coloring book, that's part of it, but also it's a bit of like a lightbox exercise. So we're combining those two tutorials, but it's mostly a coloring book, so that's what we're going to go with. And then save as type, we're going to make sure that that says Photoshop there. So a .psd is what we're looking to do. I pre-made this one, so you don't need to have one there if you are looking for it. I'm going to go ahead and press save. And you shouldn't have this unless you worked through this tutorial already, but I'm going to click yes. And now we know our project is called coloringbook.psd, and it's saved where we want it to be saved. Over on the left side of your screen, you should see the toolbar. We've been introduced to the toolbar, but not all the tools there. Paintbrush looks like a paintbrush. B on your keyboard will be the shortcut to access the paintbrush. And I have a custom paintbrush selected currently, but yours should look a little bit more like this. And it may be a different size depending on if you've used the paintbrush before or if this is your first time. So there are a couple of options for us once we look along the top of the screen for the control menu. One is this very far left that looks like a paintbrush here. These are presets for your paintbrush, and you probably don't have anything there unless you've used the paintbrush pretty extensively in the past. The next one over, so these are your basic settings for your brush. Now you can do some things like reshape your brush. You can make it a little bit flatter like that, and then you can change the angle of the brush with the little arrow on the side. Next to that, though, are size and hardness variables. So the harder your brush is, let me just correct that real quick. I have Opan. So if I draw with my brush and the hardness is turned down all the way, you'll see that you have this very feathered edge, this almost blurred edge to your brush. And then if I turn it the opposite way, go all the way up to 100%, you'll see that there's none of that. You can actually see the shape that we've created here, and they're just kind of overlapped on top of each other in a really close pattern. So you can even see the edge of your brush there with the hardness all the way up. So there's 99 options in between that 0 and 100%. I would recommend that you find something in between, and probably not 0 or 100, unless it's a very specialized look that you're going for. Now, below that, there are a whole lot of different types of brushes. And if you've downloaded brushes from the internet, you might be able to find those down here too. Additionally, though, if we click on this little gear icon, you should be able to find import brushes. So if you download a brush from the internet and you want to add it to Photoshop, you can do that right there. And let's go ahead and do that really quickly before we get into the real meat of this tutorial. So I'm going to jump out to the internet and head on over to this website called brusheezy.com. So that's BRUSHEEZY.com. And we can find a bunch of free and sometimes premium brushes to download. So these are customized brushes, and if you know what you want, you can search for it here, or you can look through their free and premium libraries. Finger Paints looks interesting. So here's Finger Paints, and because it doesn't have a premium banner on the top left corner, I know it's free. I can click download, and it'll take, 5 seconds, and you have to look at an ad, but it will download, and it will download as a .zip file. So this is kind of dependent on whether or not you're using like a Mac OS or a PC, but if you're on a Mac OS, I do believe that a .zip will automatically open, so you don't have to do any kind of unzipping or anything. But if you're on a PC, you'll at least have to open the zip folder and then remove the file. This is just a way to kind of limit the file size and make things a little bit easier for weird file types. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to move it into a folder where I can find it easily, and I'm not going to delete it by accident. All right, so there it is. It's in my graphics and effects folder, and I could head on back to Photoshop and click on the drop down for my brush settings, go to the gear icon here and go to import brushes. Now I can navigate to the .abr file that I pulled from the .zip file, click load, and now it should be loaded into my custom brushes. So there is Finger Paints at the very bottom of my list, and I can select any of these paint brushes and now start to use them. And if I want to adjust the angle, I can easily do that. And I can adjust a whole lot of other settings. So if you find yourself turning up and down the size pretty often, it does take quite a bit of time to go up to the top of the toolbar and turn these things up and down. It's a really great shortcut that I tend to use quite a bit with with brushes is open and close brackets. So it looks like It's not like a parentheses, but it's an actual bracket on your keyboard, and that will turn your brush size up and down at a relatively even rate, right? So it's going up and down by 100 pixels. Okay, if we continue to look at this top toolbar here, we have blending modes, which we haven't really gotten into with the layers panel yet, but we will get into that eventually. It's kind of how like you blend two layers together. So it's a little bit like opacity, but also kind of different. We will get into that when we go over touching up photos, but for now, we're just going to kind of skip that, and instead we'll look at opacity, which you should know from last week just affects the transparency of your brush in this case. So I can just kind of change the angle on this one, and you can see how they overlap. It's different transparency. Okay, flow is actually pretty interesting. I'm just going to go ahead and select a more conventional brush really quickly. So flow is kind of like the flow of paint from your paintbrush. So the more you turn that down, the more you'll be able to see like the actual shapes of the brush. You could say that you can kind of see the brush strokes a little bit better. But since we are working in a digital medium, it doesn't really look like brush strokes. So that's what flow does. I prefer to keep that up in the high numbers, but maybe you want to see some kind of brush strokes, especially with maybe a custom paintbrush. So a little bit further over smoothing, this is definitely an area of interest if you aren't working from something like a Wacom tablet or maybe an iPad. So right now, smoothing is set to 0. So let's just go ahead and go with the hard round brush. You can see what happens as I try to make turns. You can see how my paintbrush is kind of jaggedy. These movements are a little bit, you can really see the inconsistency in my movement. But if I turn up smoothing, you should see that stuff kind of smooth out. So as I go around circles or curves, you see that my curves are much, much smoother. Smoothing has the option to go 0 to 100, 100 being the furthest that your paintbrush will lag behind your cursor. So that's exactly what smoothing is doing. Your paintbrush falls behind your cursor, which creates a smoother movement. Now, if you look at mine, it probably looks just a little bit different than yours, and that's because I have a leash attached to my cursor. And you have one too, so long as you have the smoothing turned up, but yours is not visible. I like to have mine visible. By the way, I'm pressing Control-Z just to get rid of this stuff. Control-Z is a good friend of yours. Anytime you make a mistake, Control-Z will undo that mistake. So Control-Z is the shortcut for undo, and it's the shortcut for undo on almost every program. So if you don't know about it, it's helpful everywhere. If you are an old Photoshop user and haven't used this for a few incarnations, you might have remembered Control-Z undoes and then redoes, but in this case, since I think 2018, maybe 2019, Control-Z will just step backward over and over again. If you would like to add a leash to your brush, we can do that pretty easily. So we're going to go up into Edit and then Preferences, and then cursors. Okay, and then over here on painting cursors here, you can experiment with some of this stuff if you'd like. If you want to have a crosshair, that's just fine. That's not something that I prefer, but I do prefer this show brush leash while smoothing to be turned on. You can also change the brush leash color, which can come in handy. I think yours will be by preset. Set to like a hot pink color. And if you happen to be painting with a hot pink color, maybe that brush leash should be something that you can actually see. So lime green, I don't use lime green that often, but if I did use lime green, I would go and change the leash color. Okay, so that's how you add that if you'd like. Now, if you are doing something like what we'll be doing for our for our lightbox activity, and you have to follow pretty specific outlines, you might need to come to a specific point. And since this is lagging behind, you might be questioning how you do that. But if I just hold in my my mouse button and wait for a second, the paintbrush will catch up to the cursor. So I'm just going to press Control Z again, and that's gone. But you will notice that if you do that, in that moment, you're going to see that it really straightens out into a flat line for that last little bit of area. Now, if you want that to just kind of move a little bit quicker, we can click on the gear icon next to smoothing and click the check mark box for catch up on stroke end. So as we're painting along, if we let go of the mouse, the paintbrush will just automatically reach out to that. So if you don't want it to reach out to that, you can uncheck it. And then if you let go of your mouse click before the paintbrush catches up to your cursor, then it'll just end wherever it ends. Now, there is one other checkbox there that you might have noticed. I'm going to Control Z one more time. If I click on that gear icon and switch over to pulled string mode, you'll notice that stroke catch up and catch up on stroke end are both now grayed out because you're in a different type of smoothing mode. And if you click and hold, you'll see right away that your leash has slack in it. So imagine that you're like in an overhead view, and this is an actual string that as you pull the string, it's going to pull your paintbrush. Now, you might be questioning why you might use this over another smoothing mode. And honestly, I use the other one a little bit more, but when it comes to trying to pull smooth lines, but also very tight corners, like the one I just did there, then the pulled string mode makes a whole lot of sense. And you'll see that even with the other version, the leash length is adjustable by the smoothing percentage. So if we turn that smoothing percentage to about 50% and we're still on that pulled string mode, you'll see that the string is half as long. So it really depends on what you need and what your preferences are and what your project is, which one you'll use. And certainly if you have access to Wacom tablet, which you might through the Media Center, especially if you're an animation major, that's probably the preferred way to work for a lot of illustrators. It's a lot quicker, and there are two options here that will help you with your Wacom stylus. So as you press down on your stylus, your brush size will get a little bit thicker or darker, depending on what settings you have here. Okay, so if you have that stuff, awesome. Feel free to use it. If you don't, though, these smoothing options are really exceptional. Right now, I'm working on a trackpad on a laptop, which means that I'm severely hindered in my illustration abilities. So this pulled string mode, that looks pretty good for a laptop. Okay, there's one more thing over here that is kind of interesting, and we're going to do this even before we get into the lightbox activity, and that is this use of symmetry. So if you click on the symmetry button, you'll see that there are a bunch of options for you. I highly recommend that you experiment and see what you like here. But just to show you a basic one, I'll put a vertical symmetry on there. And if I just press enter, it's ready to go. And as I paint on one side, you'll see it appear on the other side in a symmetrical fashion. Maybe I want to add a couple of things that make it not so symmetrical. So if I go back up to symmetry and just turn my symmetry off, I can then maybe pick a different brush. I might use one of those crazy brush strokes that I had before. And I can maybe turn down the opacity a little bit, go over top, and change the angle. By the way, if you don't want to change the angle in this drop down, the angle is available to you on the right side of the control menu. All right, that's a simple little abstract something. So what I really want to show you with this, and you can certainly take a little bit more time to make your design a little bit nicer, but I want to show you how to do a pattern. It's pretty simple and easy to do. We are going to use our first selection tool. We'll go over selection tools ad nauseum next week. So we're going to use the most simple selection tool that we have, and that's the rectangular marquee tool, M on your keyboard for the shortcut. Looks like an outline of a rectangle on the toolbar. Then we're going to select an area around our illustration. Then we're going to head up to Edit and then Define Pattern. It's a little bit past halfway on the drop-down. We will define the pattern, we'll make sure that the thumbnail looks like what we want it to, and then we can just call this whatever makes sense, whatever you can find easily. So I'll call it maybe butterfly. It kind of looks like an abstract butterfly. Okay, so now I'm going to head to my layers panel and create a brand new layer. I can call this patterned background. So if I just double click the text next to the layer, I will be able to rename it. Pattern BG works for me. And then the background that already exists there, that may be a little bit distracting for me, so I can just delete it. So if I select that layer and press the trash can icon or just delete on your keyboard, that should allow you to delete it. By the way, this is what the transparent background looks like since I deleted the original background, so no more white there. It's got that checkerboard, so don't be afraid that your final image is going to look like a checkerboarded image. Instead, this is just transparency. Okay, so from here I can actually fill in my my pattern as a background. So if I go back on over to the toolbar and look, right now it's the gradient tool for me, it's G on my keyboard, but if I click and hold, remember you have extra tools in your toolbar if you click and hold. So click and hold on gradient and then select paint bucket. You should be able to find some options here. So right along the top in the control menu, once again, where it says foreground, that means foreground color. So if I clicked in the middle of my canvas right now, it would paint with the foreground color, which is that purple. But instead, what I want to paint with is a pattern. And as soon as I click pattern, you can see some options over here. Right now it's some kind of trees or something. It's hard for me to see on my resolution. But at the bottom, I can see my custom patterns, and now I can paint with the pattern that I had. Now for me, that pattern is a little bit too big, right? I'd like to kind of spread this thing out. I'd like to see a whole lot of these in my canvas. So what I'm going to do is create a new pattern that's a little bit smaller using the same stuff. So I'm going to use that same Marquee tool, draw a rectangle around the area that I like of my pattern, and then same thing that we used last week, free transform. Control T on my keyboard will allow me to shrink this item down pretty considerably. So if I wanted that to be spread across my canvas, that looks pretty good. And it's got the marquee around it already. It's selected exactly where I need it to be. So once I'm happy with the free transform, I can just press enter on my keyboard, and then I have some options to turn this into a pattern once again. So I'm going to use that rectangular marquee tool again and select out an area that works for me, maybe something like that, and then go back to edit, define pattern. We can call this butterfly small. You call it whatever you want for your project. Okay, and then once again, a new layer. And we can delete the old one because it's a little distracting, I can call this once again patterned background. Use the paint bucket, select pattern, select the pattern that is a little bit smaller, select the layer that you'd like to paint onto, which is pattern BG, and then we can paste in our pattern. And it looks okay here. Looks better than it did before for sure. And maybe what we end up doing is just another Control-T free transform and stretching that out so it fills our area in a way that's a little bit more uniform. Okay, that looks much better. All right, so there's a background for us, and then we can start working from here. The background is probably pretty bold in comparison to what we want to do on top of it. So if we want to adjust that, we can just use our opacity controls and turn that down a little bit. Remember, those checkerboards aren't going to come through in the final product. If you're really concerned about it, you can create another layer, just like what we did before. Use that paint bucket again. Use white as a foreground color. Make sure that you don't have pattern selected anymore, and paint that in white. All right, so now we have a background set up for us, and we can begin the lightbox portion of this tutorial. So to do that, you can use whatever illustrated image you'd like from the internet. We can just do a Google image search, and in this case, normally it would be important that you have a high resolution image. Even like a medium resolution image should be just fine for you. So we're going to go navigate, and anything simple is going to be a little bit easier in terms of line work because we are tracing these areas. But if you choose something a little bit more complex, it could be worthy of a portfolio piece rather than something very, very simple. I'm going to choose something moderately simple. If you end up with an image that has maybe like a watermark on it or something, that's really not going to matter for us with this project. It is important to at least consider copyright when kind of using someone else's image and kind of turning it into your own thing. In this case, I think it's fairly gray, but since we are using it for a class exercise, you're certainly safe for just the class exercise. If you're looking for something that you might sell in the future, maybe put on a t-shirt or something like that, then you might want to at least talk to someone who knows a little bit more about copyright law than me. Okay, so I found this watermarked cat image, and it is low resolution, but I just used Control-T on my keyboard to upscale it a little bit to be about the size that I want it to be in my background. I don't want this black cat over here. I just want the little skeleton cat. I think that that's kind of cute and interesting. When I'm happy with the size of it, enter on my keyboard, same as I did before. Now I can get rid of the stuff that I don't want, so it's not a distraction. I'm just going to use that rectangular marquee and select out the areas that I don't need. I can leave some of this white here if I want, but I'll just kind of get rid of a little bit of stuff. Okay, now before I start working on this background is probably going to become a pretty big distraction for me, but I do want to keep it for the final project, so I'm just going to keep it there, but the little eye icon next to it, and if you hover over it, it says indicates layer visibility. You can toggle that off or on. The shorthand for this is to shy out a layer. If we click on that eye icon, it's just gone temporarily. It's not deleted. We can always click that and it'll come back, but we'll just keep it away temporarily while we work on the lightbox portion of this project. Where it says layer 2 here, that can be a little bit confusing for me too, so I'm just going to double click it and I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it Cat Original. That way I know that everything that I do on a separate layer is my work, and everything on the Cat Original layer is the original image. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to double click that and rename it Cat That's going to be all of my work. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline every major piece of this cat. And you can use whatever you'd like in terms of brush types, brush sizes, brush smoothing. This is your chance to kind of experiment with these things to get it right. What I will do, or what I would suggest anyway, I'm just going to change this brush type. So what I would suggest to you, other than taking your time to do this carefully, is to kind of turn down the opacity of that original layer. So you get this kind of gray look, and you can use whatever color you want to outline and stuff too. But if you're using black like I'm going to use, you can actually see that show up on top of other black. So you do want to make sure that you're on your separate layer and not on that cat original layer or whatever original layer that you're working on. And then you can start to trace this thing out. A couple of other things that can help you out as you're tracing this thing out. Control plus and minus on your keyboard are zoom in and zoom out. Remember that Control Z undoes. You might use undo quite a bit for this project. And the pulled string mode is helpful when you're going around very tight corners. Also, the smoothing options for the catch-up, if you hold in your mouse click, your brush should catch up to your mouse eventually. Another tool that is kind of helpful is the hand tool to kind of move things around rather than go over to the sidebars to move up and down, especially when you are probably going to be doing it pretty often. B, remember, is the shortcut for brush. So if you're switching from hand tool back to brush, you don't have to move all the way over to the toolbar to make it happen. Now for large, uncomplicated images, you can probably use a larger brush to outline them. But as you get into more complex, detailed areas, you probably want a smaller brush. Remember that the bracket keys on your keyboard will adjust brush size if you want to do that quickly without going to the control bar. All right, I have my image now kind of traced out. And now the hard part is essentially over. I can get rid of the original cat that's underneath it here and just have my, my personally traced items available to me. So we have our lightbox portion of the project complete. And now we move on to the coloring book portion of the tutorial. And it's really, really simple from here. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that our cat outline, the cat layer that we have selected here, we might just change the layer name from cat to cat outline so we don't get confused about things. And then we can create a new layer. Just make sure that that one goes beneath the cat outline layer, and we can name that cat color. Again, if you don't have cat, you obviously wouldn't name it cat color, but you can. You feel free to if you think that that's kind of funny. All right, so we're going to use the paintbrush. We'll turn down the smoothing, probably, that's my personal preference, to 0 at this point. And then opacity, make sure it's at 100% initially, and then afterwards you can do some kind of crafty, creative things with your coloring book. So I would start with black and paint in all of the stuff that would be black with my cat, but I do want to show you really quickly what happens since we are on the layer beneath the outline. So as I paint, I'll just turn up my paintbrush real quick, size. You can see that the outline will stay there regardless of where I paint. So you do have a little bit of leeway with painting. You don't want to color outside the lines, just like with a regular coloring book, but you can color on the lines and it won't make any difference. All right, so we're going to go ahead and color all this stuff in real quick. Feel free to pause me and work on your own project as I do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint in the entirety of the background first, so like all of the cat stuff, and I'm not really going to worry about all of these bones. So I can also do this thing, and it's totally optional. Now that I have my cat colored in, I can use my brush tool and maybe go back and add like a very low opacity gray to a few areas, just to give it like a little bit of dimensionality. It really depends on what kind of illustration you've chosen to color, what you might want to do here. So in this case, I'm adding maybe like a line between the legs and a little spot on the ear, maybe the other ear as well. That just helps give it something beyond just the pure black that we would normally see that we saw in the original image. So if you have a more detailed kind of photo, you could potentially add some like shadows or highlights in any given area. Okay, so it's not looking great yet, but that's because we have to paint in all of those skull pieces. But before that, I just want to shy out that cat color that I have so I can see those bones that we outlined. We're going to go ahead and create another layer. It's going to go above the cat color layer because we want it to cover up that black stuff. It's a layer above that, right? And then we can just call this bones, or you can call it whatever it happens to be on your illustration. So I'm going to go ahead and paint these in certain colors, kind of like a sugar skull or something. I'm going to paint it all sorts of different colors because it is a coloring book project. That maybe would be better to keep it white, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to paint them in with pretty bold colors. All right, so if I zoom out, I should see that all of my detailed areas are now painted in. And if I bring back my old layers, I should see I have a completed image. Hey, look at that. If I bring back the original cat, that would actually be an issue. So I can just delete that or leave it shied out. Either way is just fine. So this would be what we're looking for, or something similar. Now you could choose the same cat as me if you can find it out on Google, on the Google image search, but I would recommend that you find something of your own personal taste. I've seen a whole lot of Pikachus in the class, but any kind of illustration you want. So this is kind of a precursor to what we'll be doing next week, and that is colorizing black and white images. So a lot of the same concepts here next week, only in a much finer detail in how we approach it. But I do want to let you know what's happening next week. That way you can prepare accordingly. Now, I will give you a package of black and white images to work through, and you can certainly use those, but you can also potentially use your own black and white photos. This tends to be a really good project if you want to make something that could be used as a present for like grandma and grandpa. So if you do take the time this week to collect whatever kind of black and white image you would want, and if you do attend during our regular lab hours next week, remember, you'll have the full week to complete the project. I can give you access to a high quality scanner if your black and white image happens to be like a hard copy or something like that. Certainly not a requirement to use your own image, but I just wanted to let you know that there is an opportunity to do that. So hopefully yours turned out pretty well. Mine is fairly simple, but it gets the job done. When you have completed this, make sure that you export your image just like you did with your memes. File, save as, and save as a JPEG at a high quality. Embed your image on Canvas, and then that is it for this week. Congratulations, you've made it through another week of Photoshop.
Okay, so if you got through that last tutorial and thought, that was pretty easy, and I would like to do something similar, but, more complex. Same workflow, but, I think I could do this with a more complicated image. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's take a photograph. You can use whichever photograph you'd like. I would recommend that you use something that's kind of unique. Maybe it's your own photograph. Maybe it's from a project that you've worked on that's video. I'm going to use something from my film, my feature film. So it's just like a work print, like highly compressed image here, and I'm going to import it into Photoshop. And then I'm going to kind of approach it the same way as the last project. I'm going to make a new layer for an outline. I'm going to outline this thing. I just kind of prefer the outer outline to be a little bit thicker than the inner ones. I'm going to do things a little bit more precisely with my brush, though. I'm going to make sure that if I have an elongated brush, I'm going to angle it in the direction that my lines are going. So like if I have a vertical line, I want my brush to be pointed like skinny vertically. And if I have horizontal lines, I'll do the other thing. But I'll try to make that angle kind of close to how my line starts, at least. And that'll make my outlines just a little bit more precise. And then underneath it, I'm going to take my original image and I'm going to add an image adjustment to this. So we're kind of cheating a little bit, I guess. It's not a fully colored image. We're going to use some of the colors from the original photograph, but like it's just a faster and easier way to work, and a little bit more precise too. What may end up happening is we end up using like 90%, like 90% will be our work and 10% will be the original colors from the image, or it could be balanced a little bit differently. It really depends on the content you have, but the image adjustment we're going to use here is called Posterize, and I think Posterize is like an image adjustment that I really almost never use, certainly not with photographs, but in this one case it sort of makes sense. So if we add that and then we adjust it, we can get something that looks like it's limiting the amount of colors from the original image in our final product, or what we're actually seeing. So we want to get that to look somewhat normal, but also to kind of get rid of all of the super fine pixels that are all over the place, and like any kind of like artifacts from video or like compression and stuff. We'll just kind of smash that all into like almost like rings of color. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sample these colors and paint them onto their own layers. So we'll have a layer for maybe like highlights, or you can also do it like regionally. So if, like in this case, you could do like mask, right? Like the whole head. could be its own layer. But the risk you run with that is, like, if you make mistakes, you might have to backtrack a little bit more. So the more layers you have, the more it's easy to fix the errors that you have, but it does take a little bit more time. So we'll sample colors. So if you just click on that little box down at the bottom left, where you can choose the color for your brush, you can sample colors from the actual image just with the color picker, the eyedropper looking thing. And then you can paint on the layer that is not your original image. And if you go up at the top control bar and adjust maybe like the opacity of your brush, maybe that kind of makes sense, especially if you're not super precise with your brush strokes. So if you're using a mouse and you want to move kind of quickly, an opacity brush kind of makes sense in this case, where you can paint a few times. It's kind of like sketching, you know. If your lines aren't super clean, you run over the line 2 or 3 times, and all of a sudden where those lines converge, that's where you kind of see the image. You can sort of do that with color here. So that's kind of your up to you and your preferences and stuff, but that's an option there. But what we really want to do is we want to just kind of like look closely at the image, and you'll see like lots of weird artifacts from Posterize, and we're going to paint all of those things out. So we don't want to see any kind of Posterize effects on it anymore, but it will help kind of fill in the gaps in terms of color and stuff. So we won't have weird edges because we're painting in those edges. And we're just going to work through the whole image like that. By the time we get to the end of it, we should have something original. We'll probably have to erase out the background and maybe put in a background if we want to do that. It kind of depends on how much of the original image you want to keep. If you want to outline the whole thing and paint in the whole thing, that's totally fine. So those are your creative decisions. I'm just going to work through this thing now and show you the final product.